Actually, our Darte session yesterday was about e-securities, so I was not supposed to talk about that because I'm very grateful that TUM Blockchain Club gives me the opportunity to talk about something that I do not have that often an opportunity to talk about. And that is the question of the growth of state surveillance and the question whether we want to fight for our privacy rights. And it's also about a continuous giving up on democratic structures, about less elected parliaments determining the rules that govern us, and more, even if at all, indirectly mandated bodies setting the rules for us. So I would actually like to start a little bit earlier, not directly with the UN Cybercrime Convention, but with the anti-money laundering rules, which already set the tone for what was coming next. So over the past half century, anti-money laundering regulation has evolved from a really narrow tool against drug cartels, dismantling organized crime, into a most far-reaching system of financial surveillance of everyone. The first laws in the 1970s were fairly modest in scope. They only targeted large cash deposits suspected to be linked to drug trafficking, and they only applied in a handful of countries. But the idea quickly spread. And in the 80s and 90s, the follow the money doctrine was enshrined and became a cornerstone of law enforcement. Then in the late 80s, the G7 created the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. I guess you all heard that term before. Who did never hear about FATF? Okay, so it's basically a group of law enforcement and financial regulatory authorities coming together without any democratic mandate, right? It's basically a club of specialists in that area, and they come up with the rules that they believe would be best to trace illicit funds. And then over time, the FATF standards and recommendations became global, and the pressure to the countries to actually adopt their rules increased. So currently they maintain a black and gray list, and when a country is blacklisted, it cannot use the international payment system anymore, right? So the economic pressure to actually adopt the FATF recommendations is extremely high. Yeah, the scope of the anti-money laundering rules expanded over time. The thresholds lowered. In crypto, it's 0, right? So any transaction is monitored. And what began as a targeted measure against drug cartels now subjects billions of ordinary transactions being monitored. All right, I seem to have lost something. Yeah, basically what it creates, I may have jumped. All right, so basically what this rule does is it says whenever you transact, and that applies in the fiat world already for 20 years, whenever you transact across borders, your personal data needs to be sent alongside with the transaction. And in crypto, that starts without any threshold. So if you go out and buy a Coke for I don't know, a fraction of any crypto, then your name, your address, your birth date, and your ID card number will be sent alongside. And that creates data honeypots all across the globe. This rule is not even limited to countries with similar privacy protections as our European GDPR, right? So it goes everywhere. And that obviously creates a lot of vulnerabilities. So specifically, the financial institutions have been among the top targets of ransomware and data breaches. So in 2023 alone, there were over 90 million individual data exposed via hacks. And that is what is created by those rules. So all of these become very high value targets, and every additional data point is ultimately a liability to us as society. Therefore, the question arises whether that constant data forwarding is actually permitted, because obviously it violates our privacy rights. And you can only, and the privacy rights in our German constitution, it's not explicitly guaranteed, but the courts have evolved and developed a structure under which privacy right is a constitutional right. In the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, it's even explicitly a right that is protected. And you can only limit constitutional rights or fundamental rights on the EU level if it is necessary, right? So the question is that data forwarding actually necessary? And we have this rule in the financial world, in the TradFi world, already for more than 20 years. I searched for 2 years now for figures, numbers, statistics about the effects of that rule. There is none. You won't find any. And if you talk to data protection officers around the globe, they will all tell you this is completely useless. So I believe, actually, this rule is infringing our fundamental rights. And I can only say, you know, maybe we need to bring this up to the courts, because the European Court of Justice has a history of invalidating data exchange agreements between Europe and the US. Those were called, the court rulings are called Schrems 1 and Schrems 1 and 2. An Austrian guy who actually brought this up to the European Court of Justice. And I always said, you know, this is clearly a case for Schrems 3. All right. Yeah, the consequences are also very interesting. When the rule was introduced, it actually led to a lot of members of third world countries who were sending remittances home into countries without, you know, proper financial systems. They were all debanked, right? Because the financial institutions, they couldn't handle with the travel rules, so they simply said, you know, we cannot serve that customer any longer, and they closed the accounts. So what happened is that those people were simply pushed into the shadow using Hawala or other systems which you cannot monitor at all anymore. So even though the European Banking Authority explicitly warned that such de-risking practices undermine financial inclusion and violate EU goals, nevertheless, the financial institutions didn't know how to cope with these rules and simply found no other way than debanking these groups. And then when you look at the FATF mutual evaluation reports, the FATF on an annual basis evaluates whether the countries comply with their recommendations, right? And if they don't, then they get grey lists and ultimately blacklist and pushed out of the global financial system. But what they actually do is they score countries on technical compliance, which is more or less a check-the-box exercise. So how many suspicious transaction reports had been rendered? But the conviction rates actually went down. In the US and in the UK over the past decades, the conviction rate for anti-money laundering decreased. So the question is why? You know, we have all these reporting systems and monitoring systems, so why are the conviction rates so low? And it's simply because the enforcement teams are overwhelmed with false positives, right? So the incentive is set to send, you know, as many suspicious transaction reports as possible. You don't want to, you know, to miss out on one because the fines are very high. So basically, the whole system is flooded with useless reports. Yeah, so that's basically what's happening when we equate quantity with quality. Next point, budget split. If you have a budget of 100 that you can spend on fighting crime, how much would you spend on the police, right, trying to prevent crime, and how much would you spend on compliance costs for the financial industry to monitor their own clients and to trace whatever the police was not capable of stopping, right? Because it's about the funds that evolved from crime. So the crime has not been prevented in the first place. How would you do the split? I can tell you how the split is, yes. But the compliance is only chasing funds that were capable by terrorists to obtain, right? But police work is about preventing that from even being happening, right? So, but I can tell you, I found only numbers for the UK. You know, those numbers are really hard to find. But for the UK, the cost of AML compliance for 2023 had been reported to be about 28.7 billion pounds. That is half of the whole UK's annual defense budget. That is only AML compliance for the industry, only AML compliance. I'm not talking about DORA, about everything else. I'm just... No, that is only for the industry, not for the public authorities. So it's like half of the whole defense budget, and it's more than 50% higher than the annual police funding in the UK, which is 17 billion. I think, you know, that clearly shows this system is out of control. So the travel rule isn't free. Banks spend millions on transaction monitoring systems, staff training, lawyers, audits, and smaller firms, especially in the fintech and crypto space, they face existential challenges. They often cannot afford building up those regulatory infrastructures. So the unintended consequence by those rules is reduced competition, consolidated power, it creates monopolies, and ultimately the costs trickle down in higher fees and less choices for all of us. So the travel rule, in my view, endangers the privacy of everyone. It increases the number of the unbanked, pushing them into the shadow, and it floods the police with useless, suspicious transaction reports, hiding the important information. And it also resulted, in my opinion, in a completely unreasonable share of total budget spent for us as a society on fighting crime. So I think this should be re-evaluated. And it's very bad, I think, what's happening in the US, but at least at that point, they start thinking, right? So now, so that was like what had been developed over the past 3 decades. And now we're coming to this thing here. So cybercrime doesn't respect national borders either. Obviously, hackers can attack around the globe. So the idea behind this convention is pretty much straightforward: create rules that enable the authorities to cooperate swiftly to fight the threats, and trace cyber criminals faster and bring justice within days and not months or years. But let's set the frame, and whoever I talked about this yesterday, please, don't tell it, but do you know who drafted this convention? It's always one country that proposes a new UN convention. Who was it in this case? Any idea? No, it was Russia. And they pushed it through with the support of China and Syria. So maybe, to set from the outset what this creature here is about. And it actually has a nickname in Russia, this convention. It's called the Global Data Accession Agreement. That's what it is for. And the reasoning was to prevent information crime. Since when is information a crime? And in light of this, you have to read this whole thing. And maybe also, nice side notice. This UN convention had been approved on the assembly on 24 December last year. It had not been on the agenda 2 days before, and it was enacted without any vote. You can watch how this happened on the video of that meeting. So basically, we have been tricked into this thing here. So against this background, the main issues with these conventions are broad and vaguely defined scope of the activities that it criminalizes, add intrusive investigative powers without proper legal safeguards to the mix, and then mandate extensive international cooperation. And here we go. Global Data Accession Agreement created. So let's look into the scope of criminalization and the acts that it actually criminalizes. And keep in mind that our freedom is also based upon effective journalism. We call them the fourth power in the democracy, right? And the work of human rights defenders. And our security, our IT security, also relies upon ethical hacking, right? People trying to find loopholes without permission, right? In Germany, Chaos Computer Club is famous for this. To spot flaws in our IT security. And all of these groups, journalists, human rights defenders, ethical hackers, they need room to maneuver to do their important work. So that's to keep in mind when talking about cybersecurity. So the definitions in the convention are worryingly broad and vague. Terms like intentional access, illegal interception, misuse of devices can be twisted by authorities. Testing, interestingly, is only mentioned once in the whole convention. And it is only mentioned in the context of misuse of device, but, for example, not in the context of intentional access. So, and that single mention is limited to authorized testing. So unauthorized testing under that convention will be completely criminalized, right? There is no ethical hacking in the future when we don't do anything about this. So imagine a journalist exposing corruption using leaked information online. Hero or criminal? So in an environment of vague legal boundaries, legitimate whistleblowers, journalists and researchers could find themselves suddenly be labeled as cybercriminals. Next concern, intrusive investigative powers without proper legal safeguards. The convention lets authorities collaborate across border in light speed. It arms governments with real-time interception, retention orders, evidence sharing, processes via metadata sweeping. It improves extradition. So it speeds up law enforcement's ability to across to cyber threats and helps authorities to trace criminals faster. But without stringent oversight, these tools become easily instruments of repression. Specifically because these investigative powers come with a lack of transparency. Most of the times you will never know that information had been shared about you. So I personally think the risk of misuse is really, really substantial. And surveillance, as we already saw with the anti-money laundering rules, is slowly becoming the norm and not the exception. Yeah, and then also a nice exercise. Come up with a guess, how many democratic states living up to the rule of law do we have around the globe? Can you do some counting? I would say maybe 40. the UN has roughly 197 members. We are a minority, right? We are not the norm. We cannot expect that things work as they do here all across the globe. So I need to speed up. Here in Europe, we are accustomed to robust protections for privacy and digital rights. Think of our strong Charter of Fundamental Rights, and I think we have, therefore, a unique responsibility to demand that at least the construction of this UN convention that we couldn't prevent in being enacted, but at least the construction of this convention needs to comply with our fundamental rights. Security, yes, we all want to live in a secure environment, but not at the cost of fundamental freedoms. And our cooperation with third-party states must never become complicity in abuse. So what can we actually do? Firstly, there will be second layer legislation coming up with the constructions of these broad terms and so forth. And while we can consider not adopting this UN resolution, right? UN conventions are not direct law enforceable here immediately, but we need to adopt it. So the first question is, do we want to adopt it? And I think we must, because if we don't, we will not have a seat at the table when it comes to the second layer regulation. And that's where we can maybe get something right again. Then with that, we always must take into account human rights safeguards when we are asked for cross-border collaboration, right? And third, we need to build stringent local oversight and accountability mechanisms. No state actions, specifically foreign state actions, without scrutiny. Separation of powers, control by courts, is a building block of our democracy. Yeah, and then finally, create transparency wherever possible and channels for civil society input. Let's remember, cybersecurity is not just about catching criminals. And Europe's digital future does not exclusively depend upon making us secure, but on keeping the internet a place for everyone, for trust, freedom, and openness. Preserving digital and privacy rights protects the very foundation of our democratic societies. So please, spread the word.